Hey! In celebration of the 4th of July, or American Independence Day, we decided to switch things up a bit here, and instead we're going to be covering lost states from the US this month. These, ghost states, yeah, let's go with that, much like ghost countries, have their own unique backstories even if they weren't ultimately successful in their bid for statehood. So with that being said, let's pay tribute to the states that didn't make it into the 50 that comprise the US of A today. And as always, if this sounds interesting to you, subscribe down below and set the bell for all notifications to never miss out on another episode. Starting off, we have Absaroka. And yeah, it's not named after any founding father or president like the others we'll be covering today, but it would have had Mount Rushmore within its borders, which I think more than makes up for that. Getting its name from the Hidatsa tribe's word for the Crow people, which translates as children of the large-beaked bird, and carved out from parts of Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota with its proposed capital at Sheridan. The story of Absaroka begins with FDR's New Deal back in the 1930s. The people of northern Wyoming, largely self-sufficient conservative ranchers and their families, working the grasslands of the high plains, were then still reeling from the impact of the Great Depression, and increasingly felt ignored by the state's Democrat-controlled government based in the South and under considerable sway of the Union Pacific Railroad. So, it wasn't long before some began to push for self-determination as a means to bring attention to, and hopefully solve, their very real Depression-era grievances. This opinion wasn't limited to just one state, though, with South Dakotans west of the Missouri River and Montanans in the state's southeastern corner circulating petitions and eventually stamping license plates for the state of Absaroka. In terms of a flag, I gotta say, it's a pretty neat design and definitely was upfront about wanting to be the 49th state. There is some speculation over coloration and whether the image you see in the later photo is the inverse of the flag. However, it's definitely a unique design. You don't really see state flags like this in the US, so that's kinda cool. A baseball player turned street commissioner named A.R. Swickard soon appointed himself governor, while members of the Sheridan Rotary Club sketched out a map of their would-be state. Then, in 1939, a Miss Absaroka pageant was held, and the King of Norway, touring in Montana, technically even made a state visit. The push for secession in the High Plains appears to have fizzled out shortly after this, though, and while the socio-political fault lines that gave rise to it still exist today, to some degree at least, Absaroka itself soon became nothing more than a distant memory. Staying in the western US, and yes, South Dakota is outside that range, we have the state of Jefferson, another contender for 49th state. Encompassing what is today southern Oregon and northern California, it should be noted the original 1941 proposal for Jefferson differed greatly from later ones that encompassed a considerably larger area. Jefferson was the brainchild of Gilbert Gable, the mayor of Port Orford, Oregon, and in many ways its reason for being parallels that of Absaroka. Believing the people in rural communities underrepresented by their respective state governments, particularly when it came to infrastructure development, Gable's proposal soon gained momentum, and by November 1941, the so-called Jefferson Border Patrol began stopping vehicles traveling along US Route 99 just outside Wairika. Members of the group, who usually carried hunting rifles for dramatic effect, reportedly handed out copies of the wannabe state's Proclamation of Independence, which among other things stated that Jefferson was in, quote, patriotic rebellion against the states of California and Oregon, end quote. The state of Jefferson's flag and seal features a gold mining pan, owing to the area's history during the gold rushes of the 19th century, and two X's representing its abandonment, or double abandonment, by California and Oregon. Taking its name from Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States who, in 1803, sent Lewis and Clark on their now famous expedition to the Pacific Northwest. Jefferson himself apparently foresaw the possibility of an independent Republic of the Pacific in the region, and his name has been attached to regional autonomy ever since. And, despite its relatively small population, the state of Jefferson would have been water-rich. This maybe doesn't sound like much, but in the western US, water rights can be more valuable than gold, and California was/is a very thirsty state. Believe me, the Midwest is perpetually on guard about any plans to access the Great Lakes. And showing how real this waterlust was, in the 1960s, there actually was a plan put forward by the completely trustworthy sounding North American Water and Power Alliance to tap into Canada's water resources. The long and short of this being, because of water, Jefferson might have held considerable leverage over its more populous southern neighbor. And for that reason, California was very much against it ever becoming a state. But while the notion of Jefferson as the 49th state was actually gaining some support elsewhere, it would be dealt a series of unforeseen setbacks. First, on December 2nd, Mayor Gilbert Gable died. Then, just a few days later, on December 7th, Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Any interest on the part of the wider American public for creating a new state was now overshadowed by the more pressing matter of World War II. Still, some have continued to push for Jefferson statehood in the 21st century. It was, in name anyway, featured in the Six Californias initiative of 2016, and in the Cascadia movement, there's even a push for independence of the entire bioregion. So, who knows, maybe we'll still get to see a state of Jefferson someday. And then you have Lincoln, which actually is a series of proposals for a new state centered in the inland Northwest, a region sometimes called the Inland Empire. This area includes northern Idaho, eastern Washington state, along with parts of Oregon and Montana. Okay, so when you look at Idaho, it's kinda strange. And that's because it was cobbled together from what remained of the Idaho Territory. The north is disconnected from the south and vice versa. The same can also be pretty much said for eastern and western Washington state, which is divided by the Cascade Mountains. Before it even became a state, however, some in Congress did recognize the problem, and in 1886 a proposal was made that would have eliminated Idaho altogether, giving the north to Washington and the south to Nevada. After considerable outcry from territorial officials, President Grover Cleveland vetoed the idea, though. And, following a chaotic transfer of the capital from Lewiston to Boise, which created a whole new divide between the northern and southern halves, Idaho became a state in 1890. Yet, almost immediately after this, plans were soon put forth to divide it. Perhaps the best known of these is the 1907 plan, which called for creating a new state from northern Idaho and eastern Washington, aligned with California's eastern boundary. Idaho's northern border would have also shifted slightly to align with Wyoming. This ultimately failed, though, as neither state was willing to give up any territory. 10 years later, in 1917, another plan was put forward to simply divide Idaho in half, but this didn't really go anywhere as well. The push for Lincoln, though, didn't end in the 20th century, and from time to time you'll still hear of attempts to redraw state borders. There also was a proposed ballot measure seeking to strip 19 counties from Oregon and create a Greater Idaho in 2020. That's still kind of floating around. As for why this proposed state would be called Lincoln, well, my best bet is the Idaho Territory was officially organized as such in 1863 under President Abraham Lincoln, so yeah. And lastly, we have Franklin. It's perhaps the best known of the ghost states covered in this episode, and for good reason. Sometimes also known as the Free Republic of Franklin, it was created from the so-called Washington District ceded by North Carolina to the Confederation Congress in 1784 to help pay off debts incurred during the American War of Independence. In doing so, North Carolina stipulated that Congress would have to accept responsibility for the area within 2 years of its cession. But for various reasons, Congress was reluctant to do so, meaning the isolated frontier settlements of the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi now found themselves without any government protection from Native American attack. North Carolina soon rescinded its offer to Congress, but unaware of this development, a full-blown secessionist movement was developing in the counties of Washington. Soon delegates met in Jonesboro, and on August 23, 1784, declared themselves independent. Drafting a constitution that excluded doctors and lawyers from being elected to the legislature, which ultimately was defeated in a referendum, the territory then submitted a petition for statehood in May 1785. More than half of the existing states voted in favor of admitting what was then known as Frankland to the Union, but the vote fell short of the 2/3 required under the Articles of Confederation. In a bid to garner support for their cause, the proposed 14th state changed its name to Franklin to curry favor with one of the country's most beloved founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. But he apparently declined.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
So, Rather than going back to North Carolina, Franklin began operating as a de facto independent republic. It moved its capital from Jonesboro, where a North Carolina parallel government was based, to Greenville, adopted a permanent constitution, opened courts, annexed 5 new counties, and proposed to commission a flag, which regrettably was never designed. I did come across this thing, which is based on some historical designs, but there's nothing specifically connecting it back to the state of Franklin per se. Anyway, all citizens of Franklin, so-called Franklinites, were granted a 2-year reprieve on paying taxes, and for the most part, the economy operated on a barter system, although US and foreign currencies were accepted. In February 1789, though, North Carolina moved to retake the territory and effectively did so by later that month. This decision was partially motivated by news that Franklin's government, desperate for help in its ongoing conflict with various Native American tribes, was considering an alliance of sorts with Spain. Not exactly excited about the prospect of a foreign country setting up shop on their border, North Carolina decided enough was enough. Those Franklinites who still held out afterwards did so in Lesser Franklin, but soon the territory was fully under North Carolinian control again, and it later would form the Southwest Territory, which eventually became the state of Tennessee. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this special episode looking into ghost states from the US. There's plenty more, obviously, that we didn't cover, and we'll be looking into those next week. So I guess I'll see you then. Peace.